Hello everyone, you are watching the 6th video in a Bible study video series. In this video we will go through Genesis chapter 6 verses 9 through 22, 22 being the end of chapter 6. You may be wondering why I ended the last video at Genesis chapter 6 verse 8. Henry H. Haley brings up in his book called Haley's Bible Handbook that Genesis is broken up into major sections. Either all or almost all of the sections begin with, "These are the generations." With that in mind, I decided to end the last video with Genesis chapter 6 verse 8. Beginning in verse 9 it says, "These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, and perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth." And then verse 11 continues into another paragraph. "And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and, behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth." The word translated in verse 9 as perfect means complete, but can also imply integrity or truth. The ways of Noah seem to be contrasted with the ways of the rest of humanity. Noah, quote, "walked with God," unquote, but the rest of humanity, quote, "had corrupted their way." Verse 13 continues, "And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is how thou shalt make it. The length of the ark 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A light shalt thou make to the ark, and to a cubit shalt thou finish it upward. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it." The word translated as "with" in verse 13 can be translated as "among" or "from," according to Strong, and the King James Version footnotes suggest this as the meaning. But the ASV, KJV, JPS, YLT, and LXX all seem to agree in their main texts that the Hebrew words say the earth would be destroyed along with the people. Which translation is best? Well, taking other verses into account, like verse 17, the King James Version footnotes is probably right. The word translated as ark in verse 14 is the same word translated as ark in Exodus chapter 2 verse 3, when Moses' mother placed him into an ark to save him, if it was possible that he could be saved. Strong suggests the meaning of the word is box. Strong says that the word transliterated as gopher in verse 14 means cypress, as in the cypress tree. Easton agrees in his dictionary by saying, "But the weight of authority is in favor of understanding by it the cypress tree, which grows abundantly in Chaldea and Armenia." You'll find that the plants and animals mentioned in the Old Testament are not always 100% identified. Sometimes there are disagreements between researchers where the evidence doesn't seem to point one way over the other. In cases when a word is somewhat ambiguous, like in this case with gopher, it will usually be transliterated instead of translated. The word translated as rooms literally means nest, but, quote, figuratively a chamber or dwelling. In other words, chambers were to be put in the ark, and, in the case of many different land animals, this probably meant pens. The first word translated as pitch is a verb that means, quote, to cover, specifically with bitumen. And the second word translated as pitch is a noun that means a cover, i.e., literally a village, as covered in, specifically bitumen as used for coating, and the henna plant as used for dyeing. The length of a cubit is not exactly known anymore, but people have tried to figure it out. According to Easton's estimated length of a sacred cubit, 21.888 inches long, the ark would have been 547.2 feet long, 91.2 feet wide, and 54.72 feet tall. Haley disagrees with Easton, believing that a cubit would have been shorter. Both Haley and Davis agree that the old cubits were probably close to 18 inches long, which is closer to the normal length of a man's elbow to fingertips measurement today. I don't know why Easton and Haley disagree with each other. Maybe more research has been done since the late 1800s, which is when Easton's dictionary was written, that leans more towards a cubit being 18 inches long instead of 21 inches long. Another possibility is that they simply disagree, neither one being backed up by the majority of the facts. Getting back to the ark, either way you measure it, it was still a big boat. Strong says that the Hebrew word translated as light in verse 16 literally means double light, but believes it can imply a window. I couldn't find any other part of the Old Testament where the same Hebrew word is used, so this may be ambiguous, like gopher. The American Standard Version footnotes says that the same word implies a roof. It sounds to me like the light, whatever it was supposed to be a cubit above the rest of the ark. In Genesis chapter 8, verses 4 through 14, the text implies that the mountains could be seen from inside the ark, but not the ground, without taking off the covering as mentioned in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. An article on creationwiki.org deals with the question of what the ark might have looked like. I'll put a link to the article on my website underneath the description for this video. You'll have to go to my website to find the article easily, or you could look for it yourself. Whatever is mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verse 16, I highly doubt that the boat was poorly made or poorly planned. The ark did have a window of some kind in it that could be opened, mentioned in Genesis chapter 8, verse 6. This is a different word than the one translated as light in chapter 6, verse 16. And it did have some kind of covering, which is mentioned in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. And it seems to have sealed something that could be looked through to see the land. The boat also had a light, mentioned here in verse 16, if this wasn't the same thing as the window. Since we're talking about Noah's Ark, I wanted to bring something up. I have recently read that Ron Wyatt's finding of Noah's Ark was a mistake at best. You can read about this at answersingenesis.org. I'll also have a link to this article on my website under the description for this video. Since I mentioned Ron Wyatt in the introduction video, I wanted to mention him again here to correct my error. Although the discovery of Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, or anything else Wyatt claimed to have found would have been an amazing find, there are other things that back up what the Bible says, and by no means are an explorer or archaeological finds what my faith hinges on. Of course, I'm not a mystical person. I believe that what I believe is grounded in reality because it's the truth. With that said, I do believe the events related in the Bible are historical, and I do believe that there is evidence for the Bible's authority and authenticity. I don't think I know enough to do this yet, but I would like to write one or more articles for my website that deal with why we can trust the Bible. Especially for now, I suggest that you bring your questions over to answersingenesis.org, creationwiki.org, or someplace like those, and I will mainly stick to understanding the text. Verse 17 continues, "And I, behold, I do bring the flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life, from under heaven. Everything that is in the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with thee, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou, and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. Of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, and of the cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind, 2 of every sort shall come unto thee, to keep them alive. And take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten, and gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them." The question might come up, how did Noah get all of these animals, and how did the animals, food, and other required items all fit in the ark? We have cruise ships today that are bigger than his boat. Well, an article written by Dr. Georgia Purdom and Bodhi Hodge, again at answersingenesis.org, mentions a logical explanation to at least part of that question. Though the Hebrew words meaning something like sort isn't in the Hebrew text in verse 19, according to the KJV, it's just added for clarity in English, and it's in italics. Hebrew words meaning something like kind is in verse 20. Noah gathered 2 of each kind of animal, not 2 of each variation of animal. Kind can be connected to Genesis chapter 1. The same Hebrew word is translated as kind in both Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 6, where we're reading, where it mentions God creating plants, fish, fowl, and beasts after their kind. The idea is that each kind of animal can reproduce only among its own kind. If this is true, then Noah wouldn't have needed to take each variety of cat, dog, horse, deer, and so on, but only 2 of each of these kinds, 2 cats, 2 dogs, and so on. As the article points out, this would have saved lots of space. Another complementary explanation for how Noah acquired all of these animals is that humans and animals might not have been quite as separated in different portions of the world as they are today, and they also were most likely more diverse. Verse 22 says, "Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, so did he." Another question that people have asked before is how Noah even built the ark in the first place. How did Noah and his 3 sons build such a huge ship alone? They may not have been alone when they built it. Haley addresses this in his book on page 73, and an article at answersingenesis.org, which I will link to on my site, tries to answer this as well.